His finger rested against a trigger adjusted to exactly 3.5 pounds of pull, not by a military armorer, but by his own hands at Camp Perry, Ohio, years before the war even began. He had bought this rifle with 2 years of National Guard pay, a Winchester Model 70, a civilian hunting rifle. And in the next 5 days, this so-called toy would become the deadliest weapon on the western perimeter of Guadalcanal. 72 hours earlier, Japanese snipers had ended the lives of 14 Americans, 14 men who never saw the muzzle flash. 14 bodies carried away under cover of darkness because the enemy owned the daylight. The battalion was paralyzed. Every movement drew fire. Every patrol returned lighter than it left. The soldiers hugged the ground, afraid to raise their heads above the foxholes. The Japanese had turned the jungle into a killing field, and the Americans had no answer. George had been told to leave his Winchester behind. Captain Morris, his superior, had looked at the rifle and shaken his head. He called it a mail-order sweetheart. He told George this wasn't a hunting trip. Modern warfare required modern weapons, M1 Garands, Thompsons, Springfield rifles issued by the Army. A sporting rifle bought from a catalog had no place in combat. George listened, nodded, and brought it anyway. He understood something his commanders did not. The Japanese snipers were not being defeated by volume of fire. They were being defeated by nothing at all. Because no American could match their patience or their precision. If you're captivated by the forgotten stories of ordinary men who shaped history, tap the subscribe button and stay with us. George was not an ordinary soldier. Born in 1921, he had been a competitive marksman since his teenage years. By 19, he was shooting alongside the Illinois Rifle Team. In 1940, he enlisted as a private in the Illinois National Guard, where he earned recognition for his exceptional skill with bolt-action rifles. When the 132nd Infantry Regiment was inducted into federal service in March 1941, George brought his shooting skills and his Winchester with him. He understood trajectory, windage, the way heat waves distorted a sight picture. He understood that killing at distance was not about squeezing a trigger, it was about controlling every variable between the muzzle and the target. And he understood that the Japanese snipers hiding in the trees above Point Cruz were masters of this discipline. They were patient, they were invisible, they were deadly. The Japanese sniper doctrine was built on concealment and patience. Their primary rifle was the Arisaka Type 99, a reliable bolt-action weapon chambered in 7.0 Some snipers used scoped Type 98 variants, carefully zeroed for jungle ranges. Japanese training emphasized becoming invisible, remaining motionless for hours, firing only when the target was certain. Their positions were typically elevated, tied into trees with ropes to prevent falling after death. They understood that even a dead sniper could reveal nothing if his body stayed hidden in the canopy. This discipline had shattered American morale across the Pacific. The 132nd Infantry Regiment had arrived on Guadalcanal on December 8, 1942. They were Army soldiers, not Marines, assigned to reinforce the exhausted men who had been fighting for 4 months. Guadalcanal was not just an island, it was a statement. The first American offensive of the Pacific War. The Japanese had built an airfield there, and the Marines had taken it in August. Since then, both sides had been bleeding each other dry. The campaign would ultimately cost 7,000 American lives and 31,000 Japanese. The 132nd was thrown into this grinder, tasked with operations west of the Guadalcanal River, a region still held by determined Japanese forces who had nowhere left to retreat. George's platoon was positioned near the ruins of a coconut grove, just west of Point Cruz. The ground was scarred by artillery and airstrikes. Splintered palms leaned at impossible angles. Craters from naval bombardment pocked the earth like wounds that would not heal. And somewhere in this devastation, the Japanese snipers operated. They had killed 3 Marines from the 2nd Battalion just 2 days earlier. They had wounded 8 more soldiers from George's own regiment. Every man in the battalion knew the enemy was watching. They just didn't know from where. On the morning of January 22nd, George set out alone. He did not ask for permission. He did not request support. He simply moved forward, carrying his Winchester Model 70 with its Lyman Alaskan scope, a handful of hand-loaded .30-06 cartridges, and a pair of binoculars. The rifle was magnificent by any standard. Even the Marine Corps' Equipment Board had evaluated the Model 70 and declared it the most accurate American-made caliber .30 rifle on the market. But the Marine brass had rejected it for official sniper use, preferring the Springfield M1903 with its military pedigree. The Army had never even considered it, so George carried his own, purchased with his own money, zeroed with his own hands. He found a position in the rubble of what had once been a supply depot. The sandbags were weathered, half buried in debris, but they provided cover and a clear sight line into the tree line where the snipers had been operating. George settled in and began to wait. This was the part most soldiers could not endure. The waiting, the motionless observation that transformed a man into a piece of the landscape. George had trained for this. Years of competitive shooting had taught him how to slow his breathing, control his heartbeat, and remain still for periods that would drive most men to madness. He watched the jungle through his scope, looking not for enemies, but for anomalies, a shadow that moved against the wind, a branch that dipped without reason, a flash of light where there should be none. At 9:17, he saw it. 93 yards distant, partially concealed behind the trunk of a palm tree, a shape that did not belong. George adjusted his scope and saw the outline of a man. A Japanese soldier was positioned in the crook of the tree, his rifle resting on a branch, his eyes scanning the American positions. The enemy sniper had chosen his position well. He was invisible to anyone not specifically looking for him. But George was specifically looking. He aligned his crosshairs, controlled his breath, and pressed the trigger. The Winchester kicked into his shoulder with the familiar jolt of a well-tuned rifle. Across the distance, the Japanese sniper jerked once and went limp. His rifle tumbled from the branch and struck the ground with a sound that carried through the jungle silence. George did not celebrate. He did not move. He immediately began scanning for a secondary threat, because Japanese snipers often operated in pairs, one to shoot, one to watch. If there was a second man, George needed to find him before the second man found George. For 47 minutes, George remained motionless. His eyes moved behind the scope, searching every shadow, every branch, every irregularity in the tree line. And then he saw it, the second sniper. This one was higher, about 60 feet up in a banyan tree, barely visible through the foliage. He was repositioning, likely moving to engage whatever American had just eliminated his partner. George calculated the angle, adjusted for elevation, and fired. The second Japanese soldier fell. 2 rounds, 2 kills. George's first engagement had lasted less than an hour. The Winchester had performed exactly as he had always known it would. Word spread quickly through the battalion. The lieutenant with the mail-order rifle had just solved a problem that had tormented the entire regiment for 3 days. But George was not interested in praise. He was interested in ammunition. He returned to the command post, reported his actions to Captain Morris, and requested permission to continue operations the following day. Morris, who had mocked the Winchester just days before, granted the request. The situation was too desperate to cling to pride. The next morning, George was back in the field. This time, he positioned himself further west, near a drainage ditch that offered concealment and multiple angles of observation. The Japanese had adapted overnight. They knew an American sniper was operating. They would be more cautious, more patient. But George was prepared to match their discipline. He arrived before dawn and waited in absolute stillness as the sun rose behind the jungle canopy. The waiting is what separates true snipers from marksmen. Any skilled shooter can hit a target on a range, but combat sniping requires something more, an almost inhuman tolerance for stillness and uncertainty. George lay in the drainage ditch for more than 4 hours before he spotted movement. A Japanese soldier was advancing through the undergrowth, carrying an Arisaka rifle with a scope mounted on top. This was not a regular infantryman. This was a trained sniper, hunting the same hunter who had killed his comrades the day before. George tracked the man through his scope. The Japanese sniper moved carefully, checking the terrain, pausing behind cover, scanning the American positions. He was good, but he made one critical error. He moved. George waited until the enemy reached a small clearing with no cover. Then he fired. The Japanese sniper fell. But before George could celebrate, a burst of machine gun fire tore into the ground near his position. The Japanese had deployed a covering force. They had expected George to return. They were trying to flush him out with automatic fire so their remaining snipers could eliminate him. George pressed himself into the mud of the drainage ditch. Bullets cracked overhead. The machine gun was sweeping left to right, probing for his location. If he moved, he would die. If he stayed, the machine gun crew would eventually walk their fire onto his position. George chose a third option. He began crawling backward through the ditch, using the vegetation to mask his movement. The machine gun fire continued, but it was directed at his original position. The Japanese believed he was still there. They did not know he had moved. George worked his way east for nearly an hour, emerging behind a pile of coral rubble that provided solid cover. From this new position, he had an angle on the machine gun crew. They were 73 yards away, partially exposed behind a fallen log. George could not eliminate the entire crew with his bolt-action rifle, but he could eliminate the gunner. He lined up the shot and fired. The gunner slumped over his weapon. The loader scrambled for cover. George did not pursue him. His mission was to eliminate snipers, not to engage in a firefight with infantry. He withdrew toward the American lines. By the end of the second day, George had confirmed 3 kills. The Japanese sniper threat that had paralyzed the battalion was beginning to crack, but the enemy was adapting. On the third day, George encountered a Japanese sniper who employed a tactic he had never seen before, a decoy. The Japanese had positioned a dummy target in a palm tree, rigged to move slightly, when a string was pulled. They were trying to bait George into revealing his position. George studied the decoy through his scope. Something was wrong. The shape was too perfect, too motionless except for the artificial twitches, and there was no rifle visible. Real snipers held their weapons. This target had nothing in its hands. George scanned the surrounding trees. If there was a decoy, there was a sniper watching it. Someone had to observe whether the trap worked. George spent 90 minutes examining every possible firing position around the decoy, and then he saw it, a slight bulge behind a banyan tree trunk, 91 feet up. The real sniper was there, waiting for George to shoot at the decoy and reveal his location. George put his crosshairs on the bulge and waited. For 17 minutes, neither man moved. Then the Japanese sniper shifted position, turning to get a better view of the decoy. The movement was tiny, less than 6 inches of exposure, but it was enough. George fired. The sniper fell from the tree, his rifle tumbling after him. George immediately swung his scope back to the decoy. If there was a second watcher, he would react to the shot. Nothing moved. George waited another hour before withdrawing. The fourth day brought the closest call of George's Guadalcanal experience. He had positioned himself in a shell crater near the junction of 2 trails, an area where Japanese movement had been reported the previous night. The position offered excellent concealment, but limited escape routes. If George was discovered, he would have few options. Shortly after OR 900, a Japanese patrol passed within 40 yards of his crater. George pressed himself into the mud and remained absolutely still. The patrol moved on without detecting him. But their passage told George something important. The Japanese were actively searching for him. They knew he was operating in this sector. They were hunting the hunter. An hour later, George spotted a Japanese sniper moving through the undergrowth. This man was not stationary. He was advancing, checking likely American positions, searching for the threat that had eliminated his comrades. George tracked him through the scope. The Japanese sniper was moving with extreme caution, pausing behind every tree, scanning every shadow. He was skilled, he was careful, but he was also predictable. George identified the next piece of cover the sniper would likely use and pre-positioned his crosshairs. When the Japanese soldier moved into position, George was already aiming at the spot. He squeezed the trigger before the enemy could settle into cover. The sniper dropped. But George had a problem. The Japanese patrol from earlier had heard the shot. He could hear them crashing through the undergrowth, moving toward the sound. George grabbed his rifle and ran. He moved east, using a creek bed to mask his trail. The jungle undergrowth tore at his uniform and scraped his skin. Behind him, he could hear Japanese voices calling to each other. They were organizing a sweep. George reached a rocky outcropping and scrambled behind it. His breathing was ragged, his heart pounding. This was not the calm, controlled environment of Camp Perry. This was survival. He pressed his back against the rocks and listened. The Japanese search pattern was moving north, away from his position. They had guessed wrong about his escape route. George waited until silence returned to the jungle, then began the long crawl back to American lines. By the morning of January 26th, Lieutenant John George had confirmed 11 Japanese snipers eliminated, with 12 rounds fired. 11 shots had hit their targets. One shot, fired at a machine gun position, had missed the intended target, but suppressed the enemy long enough for George to escape. The ratio was almost perfect. The sniper threat that had killed 14 Americans was broken. The soldiers of the 132nd Infantry could move again without the constant fear of invisible death. George reported his final tally to Captain Morris, who no longer had anything to say about mail-order rifles. The impact of George's success extended far beyond those 5 days near Point Cruz. Colonel Alexander Ferry, the regimental commander, immediately recognized what George had demonstrated. A single skilled marksman with the right equipment could achieve results that entire platoons could not match. Within days, Ferry ordered the creation of a dedicated sniper section within the 132nd Infantry. George was placed in command. He had 3 days to train 32 men in the fundamentals of precision shooting under field conditions. The training was intense but practical. George did not have time for theory. He taught his men how to estimate range by eye. He showed them how to read wind by observing vegetation. He demonstrated the patience required to wait for a clear shot. By January 30th, 32 men could hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George divided them into 16 two-man teams, a shooter and a spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand, locating targets and providing security, while the shooter focused entirely on making kills. The sniper section deployed on January 31st. Over the following 12 days, as the Guadalcanal campaign entered its final phase, George's teams accounted for 74 confirmed Japanese casualties. 74 enemy soldiers eliminated with precision fire. And the American losses during this period were 0. Not a single member of the sniper section was killed or wounded in those 12 days. The techniques George had proven in his personal duel with Japanese snipers, patience, precision, individual skill over standardized firepower, worked just as well when applied by trained teams. The Guadalcanal campaign officially ended on February 9, 1943. American and Australian forces had secured the island after 6 months of brutal fighting. The Japanese had evacuated their remaining troops in a masterfully executed night operation, slipping 13,000 men off the island while the Americans expected a renewed offensive. But the strategic outcome was clear. Japan's advance in the Pacific had been halted. The tide was turning. George did not remain on Guadalcanal to celebrate. He was evacuated with his regiment to Fiji for rest and refit. But his war was far from over. His skills had attracted attention. In 1944, he was assigned to one of the most dangerous units in the American military, the 5th 307th Composite Unit, better known as Merrill's Marauders. This was a long-range penetration force designed to operate behind Japanese lines in Burma, cutting supply routes and conducting hit-and-run attacks. It was exactly the kind of warfare that suited George's abilities. George carried his Winchester Model 70 through the jungles of Burma, just as he had carried it through Guadalcanal. The rifle that officers had mocked became a legendary weapon within the Marauders. George used it to eliminate at least 14 confirmed enemy combatants across both theaters, though he stopped counting after Burma. The rifle absorbed the punishment of jungle humidity, rough handling, and constant use. And it never failed him. The Burma campaign was even more brutal than Guadalcanal. The Marauders operated for months behind Japanese lines, often without resupply. Tropical diseases devastated the unit. Malaria, dysentery, and scrub typhus killed more men than enemy bullets. By the end of the campaign, the 5307th was combat ineffective, a hollow shell of the force that had entered the jungle. George survived, but the experience left marks that would never fully heal. After the war, George returned to the United States. He had risen to the rank of lieutenant colonel by the time he was demobilized in 1947. He attended Princeton University, a child prodigy from rural Missouri who had detoured through the bloodiest fighting of the Pacific War before reaching the ivy-covered halls of New Jersey. But George never forgot what he had learned in the jungles. In 1947, he published a book titled Shots Fired in Anger, a Rifleman's Eye View of the War in the Pacific. The book became a classic of military literature, combining personal memoir with technical analysis of weapons and tactics. George interviewed fellow soldiers, questioned prisoners, disassembled captured weapons, and documented everything he observed with a scientist's precision. The book is remarkable for its honesty. George does not romanticize combat. He describes the terror, the exhaustion, the moral compromises of war. He analyzes the Japanese banzai charge as both terrifying and tactically suicidal. He praises the M1 Garand as reliable and effective, while criticizing the Army's reluctance to embrace precision marksmanship. And he returns repeatedly to the lessons of those 5 days near Point Cruz, the value of patience, the importance of proper equipment, and the power of individual skill in an age of industrial warfare. The Winchester Model 70 that traveled with George from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal to India to Burma to Georgia eventually came to rest in a footlocker at Fort Benning, where George was stationed after the war. The rifle that no officer wanted to see in combat had proven itself in the harshest conditions imaginable. It had killed at least 14 confirmed enemies, probably more. It had launched a sniper program that saved an estimated 2,000 American lives. And it had demonstrated principles that would influence American military doctrine for the next 80 years. The story of John George and his mail-order rifle is ultimately a story about institutional blindness. The Marine Corps Equipment Board had actually tested the Winchester Model 70 before the war and concluded it was the most accurate American-made .30 caliber rifle available. They recommended it over the Springfield M1903. But headquarters rejected the recommendation, preferring the military pedigree of the Springfield to the superior accuracy of the Winchester. The Army never even considered the Model 70 for sniper use. Ordnance officers saw civilian weapons as unsuitable for military operations. The standardization that made industrial warfare possible also made innovation difficult. George had to bypass the entire system, purchasing his own rifle and bringing it to war against direct orders to prove what the technical evaluations had already shown. This pattern would repeat throughout American military history. The resistance to new ideas, the preference for institutional solutions over individual initiative, the suspicion of anything not approved by proper channels, these tendencies would frustrate innovators from the beaches of Normandy to the mountains of Afghanistan. George's success at Point Cruz did not change the Army overnight. The techniques he developed spread through his division, then through the Corps, then across Pacific commands. But they spread organically through word of mouth and demonstrated results, not through official training manuals. The principles George proved in those Guadalcanal groves, patience, precision, individual skill over standardized firepower, did not appear in Army doctrine until long after the war ended. The Japanese snipers who died near Point Cruz in January 1943 were skilled soldiers, serving a military system that emphasized individual marksmanship to a degree the American Army did not match. Japanese training produced riflemen who could hit targets at ranges that Americans considered impossible. Their concealment techniques were superior. Their patience was legendary. They had held the psychological advantage across the Pacific for months, until they encountered an American who had trained himself to the same standard. George did not defeat the Japanese snipers because he was braver or more determined. He defeated them because he was their equal in skill and had a rifle that could match their accuracy at any range they chose to engage. The Winchester Model 70 would go on to serve in American military operations for decades. Carlos Hathcock, the most famous sniper of the Vietnam War, used a Winchester Model 70 to achieve kills at ranges that seemed impossible. The rifle's accuracy, its smooth trigger, its robust action, all the qualities that George had recognized in 1943, made it the preferred weapon of skilled marksmen throughout the Cold War era. The military eventually replaced it with the Remington Model 700, a decision driven by standardization requirements rather than accuracy. But among those who understood precision shooting, the Winchester Model 70 remained the gold standard. John George lived to see his ideas vindicated. He saw the Army embrace sniper training, develop specialized equipment, and recognize the value of precision marksmanship in modern warfare. He saw his book become required reading at military academies. He saw the principles he had proven under fire become standard doctrine. What he never saw was any official acknowledgement that the officers who mocked his mail-order rifle had been wrong. The military does not issue apologies for institutional arrogance. It simply changes course and pretends the new direction was always the plan. The legacy of Point Cruz extends beyond tactics and equipment. It speaks to the nature of innovation in large organizations. George was not a rebel seeking to overturn the system. He was a skilled professional who recognized a gap between doctrine and reality. He filled that gap with his own resources and his own initiative. And when a solution worked, the system adapted, not by celebrating George, but by incorporating his methods and moving on. This is how institutions change, not through grand revelations, but through the accumulated weight of individual actions that cannot be ignored. The soldiers of the 102nd Infantry Regiment never forgot what George did for them near Point Cruz. For 3 days, they had lived in terror, unable to move without drawing fire from invisible enemies. Then, one lieutenant with a hunting rifle had walked into the jungle and methodically eliminated the threat. The sniper section he created protected them through the final days of the campaign. 74 enemy soldiers who might have killed Americans were eliminated instead. The mathematics of combat had shifted. Where the Japanese had once held the advantage, the Americans now dominated. And it had all started with a rifle that officers said had no place in modern warfare. February 7th, 1943. The Guadalcanal campaign was in its final days. George was operating near the Tanamboa River, eliminating Japanese soldiers covering the evacuation routes. His sniper section was scattered across the sector, each team hunting independently. The jungle was thick with retreating Japanese forces, desperate and dangerous. George spotted movement near the riverbank, a Japanese rifleman preparing to fire on American troops advancing along the trail. George raised his Winchester, aligned the crosshairs, and began to squeeze the trigger. He never completed the shot. A Japanese bullet struck him before he could fire, ending his personal war on Guadalcanal. George survived the wound. He was evacuated, treated, and eventually returned to duty. But his 5 days near Point Cruz were over. Those 5 days, 96 hours of hunting and being hunted, had changed the course of the campaign in his sector. They had demonstrated what a single skilled marksman could achieve. They had launched a sniper program that would save thousands of lives, and they had proven that a mail-order rifle in the right hands was the deadliest weapon on the battlefield. The jungle near Point Cruz is quiet now. The coral bunkers have crumbled. The shell craters have filled with vegetation. Honiara, the capital of the Solomon Islands, has grown up around the battlefield where George and the Japanese snipers fought their private war. Tourists walk the beaches without knowing what happened there. The names of the 14 Americans killed by Japanese snipers before George's arrival are recorded in official casualty lists, but few remember them. The names of the 11 Japanese snipers George eliminated are lost to history entirely. War reduces men to numbers, and time erases even the numbers. But the lessons remain. Patience defeats haste. Precision defeats volume. Individual skill, properly supported, can achieve what institutional force cannot. John George proved these lessons with a rifle he bought from a catalog and carried against orders into the deadliest jungle warfare of the Second World War. The officers who mocked him are forgotten. The system that rejected his weapon eventually adopted his methods. And the Winchester Model 70 that nobody wanted in combat became the template for American military sniping for the next 50 years. George's book concludes with a meditation on what combat teaches a man, not glory. There is no glory in watching men die through a rifle scope, not hatred. The enemy soldiers were professionals doing their duty, just as George was doing his. What combat teaches, George wrote, is the absolute importance of preparation. Every hour spent at Camp Perry, every cartridge loaded by hand, every adjustment made to his rifle's trigger, all of it mattered. When the moment came to fire, there was no time for doubt or hesitation. Either you were ready or you were dead. George was ready. And 11 Japanese snipers near Point Cruz discovered in the last seconds of their lives what that readiness meant. The men who served with George remembered him as quiet, methodical, and utterly focused. He did not seek recognition. He did not celebrate his kills. He simply identified problems and solved them with the tools available. When the tools were inadequate, he brought his own. When the doctrine was wrong, he ignored it. When the officers objected, he proved them wrong with results they could not argue with. This is the essence of effective leadership in impossible situations. Not commanding men to do the impossible, but showing them it can be done. The final evacuation of Japanese forces from Guadalcanal was completed on February 7, 1943. The same day George was wounded. 13,000 Japanese soldiers escaped in a brilliant night operation that the Americans did not detect until it was over. The Japanese had lost the island, but they had saved their army. They would fight on for 2 more years across dozens of islands in conditions even more brutal than Guadalcanal. And American forces would carry the lessons of Point Cruz with them, the lesson that precision mattered, that patience mattered, that the right man with the right rifle could change the mathematics of combat. John George died decades after the war, having lived to see his ideas become orthodoxy. His Winchester Model 70 presumably still exists somewhere, a piece of maple and steel that traveled from a catalog in Illinois to the jungles of the Pacific and back again. It is not in a museum. It is not celebrated with a plaque. It was, after all, just a mail-order rifle, the kind of thing that has no place in modern warfare, except when it does. Except when one man ignores the experts, trusts his training, and walks into the jungle alone to solve a problem that battalions could not solve together. Then, and only then, does everyone remember why precision matters, why patience matters, why the experts are sometimes wrong. The ghosts of Point Cruz, American and Japanese alike, have long since faded into the jungle they fought over. The coral bunkers are overgrown, the foxholes have collapsed. The trees that Japanese snipers climbed have grown and fallen and grown again. But somewhere in the historical record, in casualty reports and after-action reviews, and a book that remains in print after 70 years, the story survives. The story of 11 snipers who thought they were invisible. The story of 14 Americans who died before anyone could answer. And the story of one lieutenant who brought his own rifle to the war because no one else would give him what he needed. They mocked his mail-order rifle. They told him to leave it in his tent. They said civilian weapons had no place in combat. Then they watched him eliminate a threat that had paralyzed an entire battalion. They watched him train a sniper section that would account for 74 enemy casualties without losing a single man. They watched his method spread through the division, the Corps, the entire Pacific Theater, and when the war was over, when the doctrine had changed, and the manuals had been rewritten, nobody remembered the officers who said it couldn't be done. They only remembered the man who did it anyway. The morning sun barely cut through the jungle canopy near Point Cruz. January 22, 1943. Lieutenant John George crouched behind a wall of sandbags, his eyes scanning the tree line through a scope most officers in his battalion had openly mocked. Somewhere in that wall of green a Japanese sniper was waiting, and so was George.